Happy Washington's birthday weekend. This is Adam Taxin with a classmate of mine from my undergraduate years at Harvard, David Lefer, who is a historian based in New York and the author of the recent book, The Founding Conservatives, How a Group of Unsung Heroes Saved the American Revolution. Now, as you know, George Washington gets plenty of publicity. I mean, the guy deserves it. I don't know how you celebrated Washington's birthday, maybe with some cherry pie. Who knows? But I thought we'd do something a little bit different here, and David's book is going to be very helpful. We're going to talk about some of the supporting players who are covered in David Lefer's book, some of the supporting players who made George Washington George Washington. Dave, thanks for being with me. Let's talk about some of these guys.
Well, I just want to say it's a great honor to be on your show.
No, it isn't. This show's no big deal. It's no big deal, but thank you anyway. It's not even a show. I do YouTube clips directly. It's very 2014, but thank you anyhow.
What's interesting is a lot of people, I think, these days call it President's Day or President's Day weekend, and I think they're missing the point because the real holiday is actually Washington's birthday, and President's Day really only became big in the 80s as basically a marketing strategy to get people to go to sales. But when you think about Washington's birthday, you have to realize that you're talking about all of his life and all of his contributions, and not just Washington the president. And I think we tend to focus just on his administration. When you think about Washington's life, he contributed so much before he was president. And I think that's one reason some of his political allies have gotten short shrift a little bit in history. And, they're the ones who really, throughout the American Revolution, throughout the war for independence, really held this country together and allowed it to win the war with Washington as commander-in-chief.
Who should we talk about first? I like John Dickinson. I'm only about 40 pages into your book, and you focus on him at the beginning, and I happen to be a little biased, being from the Pennsylvania-Delaware border myself, and he was born in Delaware and was a big part of Pennsylvania politics. Can we talk about him first?
Sure. Dickinson was one of the pivotal members of the American Revolution, and in some ways, his own contemporaries said that had it not been for Dickinson, it's unlikely America would have ever revolted in the first place. He wrote some letters in 1760s, which really they really crystallized American thinking and the problems they had with what the British were trying to do in terms of illegally taxing Americans. And he was a lawyer by training, so he started off with this group of essays that were really the literary hit of the decade. But he was recognized for not just these letters; it's really his skill as a writer and a defender of American liberties, which secured his place in history. One thing he really opposed was a radical rush to independence. And it wasn't because he opposed independence, it was because he said, as a conservative, you really have to think about the consequences of what you do. You can't just rush into things. And he said, we don't have an army, we don't have any money, we don't have even a government, we don't have any foreign allies. How are we going to take on the British, the mightiest war machine in the entire world at the time? And so he basically single-handedly delayed independence long enough for America to become more unified. And even at the 1776, July 1776, he was warning about how unprepared America was and how it really had better prepare for a long and difficult war. But he went on from there, and even though he refused to sign the Declaration of Independence, and this is very interesting, but he was not a Tory. In fact, the very next day after he voted he actually abstained, which allowed independence to be passed unanimously. He marched off as a colonel of a Philadelphia militia to join Washington's forces outside New York City, where they were preparing for the British invasion. So he was a staunch American patriot. And that same week, when he was preparing to march off to war, he wrote the first draft of the Articles of Confederation, which was the first real government of the United States. He became governor of both Pennsylvania and Delaware simultaneously. He fought with distinction in the Battle of Brandywine against the British. And at the Constitutional Convention, Dickinson actually forged a crucial compromise that saved the convention. The delegates were ready to walk out. Dickinson basically is the one who came up with the idea that the House should represent the proportional to population, and the Senate should be proportional to the number of states.
Oh, that was him.
So that was him. It's really remarkable. He did so much. And one of the things that really, I think, is one of his biggest influences on the Constitution was its emphasis on, he really pushed for a reliance on precedent, on tradition, and, very traditional conservative values. There are some of the Constitutional Convention who were really enamored of the French philosophes who were, leading very, within like 2 years before, actually what am I saying, it's 2 years, 2 years before the French Revolution breaks out. So there are many at the time who say, we just should follow pure reason. And he said, reason may mislead us. He said, we have to look to experience. And that really, I think, crystallizes conservative thinking right around the time of the Constitution.
Let me ask you, what was his relationship like with Washington? And just a more Philadelphia-oriented question, what was his relationship like with Ben Franklin?
He was actually Franklin's political enemy in the beginning of his career, and by the end of it, they worked together very well. After Dickinson was the president, or what we now call governor of Pennsylvania, Franklin took over, and they were very amicable in the end. Dickinson and Washington were very close friends, and Dickinson personally spent his own money to raise money for the war. And a lot of people don't realize how close the war was to being lost. Many moments. And one of the things Washington was continually complaining about was how disorganized and feckless Congress was. There were a lot of radicals during the Revolution, and this is bizarre to think that they were in the middle of a war, and the radicals were so anti-military that they would not give any money to the army. They wouldn't pay the soldiers. And it was the conservatives during the Revolution who said, we have to support the military. So those are the two big things that Washington and Dickinson really agreed on. They agreed, there are two things. They agreed on the strong military was absolutely vital to the country's survival. And the other thing they really agreed on was the importance of free market capitalism. There were a lot of people at the time who argued that we should have just basically a total egalitarian society. In fact, there was a radical government in Pennsylvania that took over right after the 1776. And one of the first things they did was they took away the right to bear arms from anyone who disagreed with them. They restricted the freedom of speech and freedom of the press. They established jails for anyone who disagreed with them. And they tried passing a law that would actually limit the amount of wealth any person could possess. So if you own more than a certain amount of property, the government would just come in and seize your property. And Dickinson, along with Washington, really abhorred this idea, and they fought tooth and nail to stop it. One of Dickinson and Washington's close allies, James Wilson, for example, whom Washington later appointed to the Supreme Court, was really probably the foremost advocate for free market capitalism in America. He and Dickinson helped found the very first bank in the United States, the first multinational corporation. And
are you talking about the North American Bank, or are you talking about the
Bank of North America?
Bank of North America.
So they actually, this is before Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton learned a lot from Dickinson and Wilson and Washington and those allies of theirs. They were really staunch advocates, Washington among them.
Yeah. Now, of course, someone like G. Edward Griffin, who wrote The Creature from Jekyll Island, would not be a big fan of Edward Wilson, but we won't get into the definitions of conservatism because very harsh to the whole, but we'll talk about the Fed and the roots of that another day. But let's talk a little bit more about James Wilson, if only because James Wilson's the name of one of our more popular Harvard classmates, Harry Wilson, and he just passed away a few months ago, so I'm partial to guys named James Wilson. But he was someone, I haven't gotten to him in the book, but, it's someone you obviously have a lot of admiration for.
I definitely do. He was a Scottish immigrant. He actually studied law with John Dickinson, and he became one of the foremost advocates, as I was saying, for free market capitalism. In fact, he was the first person, I think he's probably the first person in America to read Adam Smith's work, The Wealth of Nations, which was published in 1776, but didn't make it across the ocean for a few more years. And Dickinson thought it was so influenced by it, he started handing out copies of The Wealth of Nations by, to everyone he could meet, saying, this is how we have to, if we want to create a prosperous America, a strong America with a strong industrial base, this is how we have to do it. It was not a popular position, by the way, and one of the things Wilson also made himself unpopular over in Philadelphia was his opposition to price controls, because the radical government during the war said, well, prices are going up, there's too much inflation, and they refused to listen to Wilson, who said, well, you're just printing too much money. If you have too much money in circulation, inflation will go up, and they just kept running the printing presses till basically the continental dollar was worthless. And so the economy was at the point of collapse in 1780, and Wilson had been saying that you can't do this. You have to allow the free market to work. You have to allow merchants to sell at whatever price the market will bear. And he was so vilified for this attitude that in 1779, a mob of 100 marched on his house and were actually threatening to blow up his house with a cannon. And it became called the Fort Wilson Riot because all the top conservatives in Philadelphia at the time rushed to Wilson's house, and they actually started shooting at each other. There were, mobs, and basically they were only saved in the end because the cavalry literally rode in and dispersed the mob. But after all the bloodshed and gunfiring at each other, I think there were like 12, 14 wounded, 5 men lay dead in the cobblestones below the house. And actually, the Harvard historian Samuel Eliot Morrison said that had Wilson and his friends not defended themselves that day, the brawl would have been to the American Revolution what the capture of Bastille was to the French Revolution. Even the British capture of Philadelphia 2 years before had been less bloody. I mean, that's how bad we think that between radicals and conservatives today. Back then, it was just as bad, if not worse.
Let me just do a quick digression. Do you remember where in Philadelphia, because I am a Philly guy, his house was? I'm just curious.
It was at his house. I believe it was on Walnut Street, and I might be wrong. It's on 2nd or 3rd.
Oh, that's where my extended family had their famous restaurant. Old Original Bookbinders was right around there. I should know these things.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. I don't want to go too long because I want people actually to listen to this, and if they see more than 10 minutes, they probably won't. But why don't we pick one more person who was a major supporting player in making George Washington the George Washington we know?
Third one I'd say is Robert Morris. Again, very, very close ally of Washington's. They worked hand in hand. So while Washington was commander-in-chief of the army, the American government was just in such a state of disrepair, the economy was so bad, that they realized they had to appoint someone basically as America's first prime minister. That's roughly what historians say that Robert Morris became in 1780. His official title was the financier, and he was in charge of all finances for the United States. So while Washington was trying to drum up money to pay the troops, who, by the way, were, despite their patriotism, they were repeatedly mutinied because they hadn't been paid in years in some cases. And Morris realized just how badly wrecked the American economy had become because the radicals had been running the printing presses for so long with the currency. And he basically said, you know what, the dollar is so worthless now, I'm going to scrap it, and I'm going to do my own currency. And in fact, Americans, for the last few years of the war, used Robert Morris's private currency called Morris notes, and was backed by the full faith and credit of Robert Morris. He happened to be one of the richest merchants in all of the colonies in early America. And because he was so well trusted by merchants around the world, he alone, almost single-handedly, was able to prop up the American economy. There's an amazing story that, and I'll end with this. On the march to Yorktown, so first of all, Morris is the one who actually had to organize all the pay and money and transportation from Washington's camps up in New York State down to Virginia to Yorktown, because they knew that there was a surprise attack on the British. People probably know the story. The French fleet was going to come, but they had to get the troops to Yorktown just in time to meet the French so they could defeat the British, and that really was the pivotal final battle of the war. And Morris knew how difficult it would be getting all these thousands of troops south. They got as far as Philadelphia, and it was one of the biggest mutinies in all of the American Revolution. The soldiers said, we have not been paid or fed adequately in so long that we're not going to march another step until we get paid. And Morris basically ran around like crazy for half a day, collected all the money he had on his own personal credit, brought forth to these mutinying soldiers, cast huge barrels of silver and gold coins, and broke them open in front of these soldiers. And it was the first time they'd actually seen hard money in gold and silver that basically spilled in a giant puddle toward their feet. And he said, will this do? You have to go to Yorktown. We have to get there to meet the French fleet. And the soldiers said, you got it. And they marched, and it was the pivotal American victory of the war, which really ended the revolution and made America the country it is today.
All right, David, thank you for helping me celebrate Washington's birthday, not President's Day, we'll call it Washington's birthday. The book, again, is The Founding Conservatives, How a Group of Unsung Heroes Saved the American Revolution. I've been talking with its author, David Lefer. David, I'm sure we'll talk again after I've made a lot more progress into the book, but I'm very interested in what I've been reading so far. And thank you for taking the time to talk with me.
Thank you.